And thank you for inviting me to speak on the Woolworth building as the highest skyscraper in the world, the focus of this talk tonight. As you all already know, it's the centennial of the Woolworth building, and as Carol has already outlined, the two of us together curated this exhibition in celebration of the centennial, the Woolworth building at 100, which you're surrounded with here. This is the second talk that I'm giving on the Woolworth building, and I know some of you have already come to the first one. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects on the design of the Woolworth building as a landmark. And it was relatively broadly conceived. And tonight, I will be more focused and more specific. As Carol mentioned, we had worked together on this exhibition, looking at a number of drawings, laying out drawings, reviewing the sequence of drawings that illustrated the process of design. And this is all very interesting, and it raised some new questions. And Carol brought up this notion, which I thought was interesting. It's something I, of course, know, and many of us know this, but she really pointed it out in a very interesting way, that the Woolworth building did not start out as the world's tallest building. Typically, what we assume today is a client, a person who wants to build the world's tallest building, will go shopping for an architect, and the architect will design that world's tallest building, and that's it. That's the aim of the project from the outset, but that was not the case with the Woolworth building. Carol pointed this out, and I thought it was very important that Frank Woolworth did not go shopping for Gilbert to build him the world's tallest building. It did not start out as the world's tallest building. It started out as a 20-story office building. So how and when, was the question, was this decision made to take this structure up to an unprecedented height, the height for which the Woolworth building became known around the world as the world's tallest building? Why? Why this decision? And that's the focus of my talk tonight. And some of you, I think, already know this with regard to this client-architect relationship, given that you've heard what I've said last week. But here they are, on your left, Frank Woolworth, on your right, Gilbert, vacationing together in Palm Beach. And, of course, on the right there, the Woolworth building. One of my favorite views of the building, by the way, because I really love the way you can sort of see the city around it. You can see the City Hall Park just in front of it and the dynamic activity of Lower Broadway. Beyond question, Frank Woolworth, the retailing innovator and founder of the famous chain of 5 and 10 cent stores, and Gilbert, the noted Beaux-Arts architect, knew that building a skyscraper is the highest in the world. If they were to do this, they knew this at a certain point in the project, they would attract media attention around the world. They also knew at a certain point in the project that such a major project would bring distinction to New York. And the question is, when did all of this happen? The project did not start out as the world's tallest building. When Woolworth commissioned Gilbert as his architect in mid-April 1910, he asked for a 20-story Woolworth Bank and office building. It was not until mid-January 1911, 9 months later, that Gilbert actually produced the drawing for what we recognize today as the world's tallest building. Shortly after completing the design for the world's tallest, they took this vacation together in Palm Beach. You see them here on the left. It was March 1911. Gilbert's wife was with them, Julia Finch Gilbert. She had planned this vacation as a way to get Gilbert away from the project. He was exhausted, through this kind of exhausting process. Let's get away, go down to Florida, to Palm Beach, and take a vacation. Gilbert said, I can't leave Woolworth. I really, at this point, it's not a good idea to leave my client. So can I bring him along on our vacation? And Finch Gilbert finally said, okay, bring him along. She agreed. She wrote a later account, very interesting account. It's at the Library of Congress, called An Experience, of this entire vacation. It's several pages long. But one of the things she said in this account was that her husband, Gilbert, and Woolworth, quote, conspired together with the result that it was decided to make the skyscraper the highest in the world. So that's what Finch Gilbert said. But who really decided? Who really decided? Well, Woolworth and Gilbert, not surprisingly, would have very different aims from the project, as I'll show you. But both shared an interest in the city, and both knew that building the world's highest skyscraper would be pointless. It would be pointless if the skyscraper did not meet a certain artistic standard. Well, what was that standard? The critic Montgomery Schuyler, a very perceptive contemporary critic, described that standard. Meanwhile, the competition is not only commercial, but in a measure artistic. No grad grind of a projector would dare attack the record without some thought as to how his record beater is going to look. That's Montgomery Schuyler. New York's competitive environment for vertical construction was well established by 1910, the year that Woolworth and Gilbert began work on their skyscraper. This is particularly the case in the immediate vicinity of the site for their project, at the intersection of Lower Broadway with Park Place, but also City Hall Park, which was the key public space in Lower Manhattan. Beginning in the 1870s, at the southeastern edge of City Hall Park, along Park Row, the city's leading newspapers built towering headquarters. The Tribune building, and you see here left with its central tower flanking the Brooklyn Bridge, facing the park, was one of the city's first skyscrapers. It was built in 1873 to 5 to a height of 260 feet, and at that time that was a world's record for height. Then later the World Building, which you're seeing there on the right with the gilded dome designed by George Post, who's also an engineer, an architect and engineer, at 309 feet, and it was 18 stories of cage construction, set yet another world's record for height. The World towered over the Tribune, stealing light and air. These two newspapers and others were competing for the widest possible readership in New York, and they played out their sense of competition on the city skyline. So the larger readership they had, the better, and they were all competing, and the sense of competition was expressed in their architecture as well. What counted was height for height's sake. The quantity of news production within the city generally had increased 40-fold on account of new refinements and recently mechanized printing processes, and the printed news media had taken on a new prominence in city life. Many more people were reading newspapers. So the newspapers competed, and they competed in their headquarters for the spectators' attention, not only with height was important, but also with dazzling color and ornament, whether through the Tribune's intricate Gothic campanile or the World's multicolored exterior and gilded Baroque dome, which, by the way, is mocking the dome of the City Hall. Neither building, each in part a factory for newspaper production, was known for its gracious interior. One contemporary described the Tribune's mean accommodations, notoriously cramped and poorly lit, as the very antithesis of the exterior's sensationalism and show. The City Hall functioned as a center for news and information. And for crowds of spectators in the park, the newspapers announced the latest in world events on bulletin boards. And you're seeing the New York Journal and the New York Tribune, a building providing the latest updates during Admiral Dewey's Great Battle of Manila Bay, the Spanish-American War, 1898 to 99. The newspaper enterprises may have found it advantageous to locate in such a civic-spirited center of mass public events and journalistic coverage. Such a means of communicating the news showed that the news itself had become a spectatorial phenomenon, extending beyond print into the public spaces of the city. By 1903, the leadership of the Tribune, resenting the world's architectural dominance, retaliated, adding 100 feet or 8 stories to the top of its tower, literally jacking itself up over the world, as if to say, I'm bigger than you, taller than you, suggesting a medieval sense of elation about building high. But by that time, construction had already begun on R.H. Robertson's Park Row building, which you see there on the right, a few hundred feet to the southwest along Park Row, which towered over for both the World and the Tribune, setting still another new world record for height at 391 feet and 37 stories. Designed by the Ivan Syndicate as a speculative office building, it sported 2 cupolas that also served as observatories. The Park Row building's engineer, Nathaniel Roberts, designed an all-steel frame with portal bracing, by contrast to post-metal cage for the World building, to achieve great openness for the 950 offices of the interior and great height. In the skyline views of New York, which were published in Harper's Weekly in 1897, the top view dated 1881 and the lower one 1897, you can see how the profile of the city had changed. The twin cupolas of the Park Row building and the lower view, topped by flags, dominate that view. Other tall skyscrapers with steel skeleton construction to make their mark. The light-colored terracotta exterior of the American Surety Building, 1894 to 95 at 308 feet towards the center of the view, and the Manhattan Life Insurance Company, 1894 at 348 feet just to the right of the American Surety Building, to that lower view. It's crowned by a cupola, that Manhattan Life Insurance Company building. At the 20th century's turn, critics debated the aesthetics and meanings of this new skyline. For Henry James, the skyline signified no less than a vast, crude democracy of trade. And for Schuyler, who called the Park Row building a horned monster, it suggested individuals merged in a riot, bewildering and stupefying in the mass, with no ensemble but that of strife and struggle. Chicago imposed a height restriction after the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. That was 130 feet. And with the construction during the 1890s of towers such as the Manhattan Life Insurance Company building and the Park Row building, both to record heights, New York became the nation's skyscraper capital. This is where it was happening. But the Singer Tower, with its leap in height, was a quantum leap. In 1906, 208, rose nearly twice as tall as the Park Row building, and at 612 feet, it clearly dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. It represented the boldest expression to date of New York's increasingly ambitious dynamic of vertical construction. Designed by Ernest Flagg, trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, it had this very distinctive, it was called modern French, and very memorable, highly ornamental, modern French or French Second Empire crown. Very, very distinctive image of a building for the skyline.
That is right.
Yes. Yeah. As the tallest building in the world, and you see it here towards the center of the view on the top, the Singer Tower did dominate the skyline, and it did dwarf the twin cupolas, which you can see to the left of that view on the top of the Park Row building. The critic John Van Dyke reported that it marked the breaking through of another stratum of ether to create a striking silhouette in the city, and Harrison Rhodes noted that such towers embodied the romance of the future. For Flagg, the Singer Tower's design suggested a new identity for New York as a city of towers, and this is Flagg's sketch. It's attributed to Flagg below here. Flagg considered the Singer Tower as a model for the skyscrapers in the skyline of the future. Such a skyline would be composed of isolated pinnacles, occupying only a quarter of a site's buildable area and ascending upwards to previously unconquerable heights. The city of towers would be a thoroughly modern city, albeit with echoes of Europe, in which the potentials of the elevator and the steel frame had been carried to a logical conclusion. The city of the 20th century. Flagg was reacting to buildings such as the City Investing Building, the bulkiest building to date, designed by Francis Kimball, 1906-208, with 500,000 square feet of floor area, which rose adjacent to the Singer Tower during the course of construction, compromising its isolation and its distinction in city views. The popular imagery in King's Views of New York, which you see on the right, illustrated the future of a city built up with such intensive speculative construction. The resulting extreme density wreaked havoc in the city, creating a babel of confusion, casting streets in perpetual darkness and subjecting citizens to the incessant roar of traffic. The Singer Tower's record for height was short-lived. Within 2 years, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower rose 700 feet high to set yet another record for the world's tallest building. Built on a site facing another significant open space in New York, Madison Square, Pierre Lebrun designed the tower as a Venetian campanile, a memorable and very different from that of the Singer Tower, virtually a copy of St. Mark's in Venice. A rapid success, culminating with the Metropolitan Life Insurance, inspired ongoing speculation in the city's printed news media. Here, the World Sunday edition of 1907. How far can New York climb into the sky? A couple years later, Montgomery Schuyler would note, precarious and fleeting, almost ephemeral. What next? Truly, what is the limit? It was very clear that the limit is commercial, not technical. In the absence of restraining laws, every projector of a building built for profit will get as high as he thinks it will pay to carry it. The sudden upstart of Beanstalk is nothing to the swiftness of these latter uprisings. They shoot up, you wait. In 1910, when Woolworth decided to build his skyscraper in New York, he owned a total of 300 stores in the United States, Canada, and England with an annual sales of close to 30 million. Looking out from his headquarters in the Stewart Building's fifth story across City Hall Park, Woolworth could not help but notice Lower Manhattan in a perpetual, almost convulsive conquest of vertical space, simply bursting its bonds, observed Harper's Weekly. In 1902, it was as if some mighty force were astir beneath the ground, hour by hour, pushing up structures that a dozen years ago would have been inconceivable. Woolworth especially admired the Singer Tower, noting that, he told his friends, his associates, it gave me an idea, that's a quote. Functioning on the skyline like a trademark, at least he saw it that way, it caught the spectator's eye in the competitive, constantly changing, visually strident environment of the city. Woolworth chose a site for his skyscraper at Broadway and Park Place, at the southeast corner of City Hall Park, at a strategic distance from the crowded towers of the financial district. And it's directly across the Broadway from the French Second Empire Post Office, which was later demolished in 1939. Evaluating the skyscraper potential store customers, Woolworth noticed that the city's sidewalk crowds became especially dense at the intersection of Broadway and Park Place, and hence his choice of this site. But it was the open expanse of City Hall Park that counted most to Woolworth, and he knew that the park was often filled with crowds. He also knew that the park would provide a view from a distance. Distant viewing angles enhance high visibility for his skyscraper. Soon enough, he would use the words giant signboard. It would be, he'd build it so that it would be seen from a distance and like a sign, and it would advertise his stores around the world. Woolworth, determined to take his stores to the people, viewed city sidewalks, public open spaces filled with crowds, as environments conducive to the stimulation of consumer desire. He chose sites for his stores in well-traveled locations on the main streets of towns and cities across the United States and recently in England. He contrived an array of strategies for heightening the appeal of his commodities to the sidewalk shopper. Besides show window displays, they incorporated his own Diamond W trademark, which he designed himself in 1886, and his storefront, again his own design, with a large billboard-like sign that he standardized in 1900. He was also known for his fabrication of theatrical store opening extravaganzas, during which he aimed to entertain, and these were quite the extravaganzas. He often had orchestras and theater as part of them, even dazzle sidewalk crowds. Throughout the Woolworth building's sequential stages of design and construction, not surprisingly, Woolworth would weave into the project architectural and urban decisions informed by such earlier experiences. In 1901, Woolworth commemorated the founding of his first 5 and 10-cent store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with the construction of his first Woolworth building, which locals called a skyscraper, simply because it towered so high over its surroundings. He dedicated it with a showy opening celebratory extravaganza. It was illuminated at night with twinkling lights and visible for miles. By virtue of its height and prominence, the Lancaster Woolworth building became a new center of attraction within the city, changing the so-called wrong side of Queen Street, which was the main shopping street, to the right side of the street. And this was Woolworth's plan. He later recalled pointing out to the local skeptics that his experiment with improving Queen Street's property values had in fact succeeded. It was modeled on the newest department stores in Paris, a little bit of theater there, though, a little bit of Coney Island. It featured a Woolworth store in its ground story with a restaurant, a roof garden for theatrical spectacles, and 4 stories of speculative offices sandwiched in between. So, for me, it was interesting that he chose Cass Gilbert as his architect, and this was April 1910. But when I thought through this a little bit further, I realized that, well, Woolworth had, in fact, seen the Custom House, which was completed by 1906, and he also was familiar the Minnesota State Capitol. He called these buildings magnificent and artistic. He just thought these were wonderful, monumental Beaux-Arts designs, very different from his stores, but nonetheless he appreciated them. Gilbert had established his practice in New York in 1899, and the Custom House Commission was what allowed him to do that. It was a very substantial commission. And he was working on the Custom as he was completing the Minnesota State Capitol there on your left. Gilbert's architecture reflected his understanding of principles of Beaux-Arts composition. He had studied architecture at MIT. It was known for its monumentality and fine proportions. He had apprenticed with McKim, Mead and White. He especially appreciated Stanford White's skill with ornament. He took frequent sketching tours of Europe. He aimed to travel in Europe every single year, sketch, and he produced lovely watercolors, which are still with us today. He was skilled at transforming these sources from Europe into highly pictorial compositions. And that's not my word, that's his word. He wanted his buildings to be memorable, even pictorial. He used every possible means available in the day's architectural repertoire: gleaming white marble at the Capitol, gilded sculptures in the Custom House, bold rustication, a very elaborate program of ornament and allegorical sculpture carving. These were compositions that were destined to stand out in the city and to compete with the many other things, the many diversions and enticements that in the city that engaged the eye of the sidewalk spectator. Woolworth was especially well acquainted with the Custom House, as I suggested. He was known by 1900 as the largest importer, and all the imports, came in through he had to actually pay for his imports, the duties at the Custom House. The largest importer of half the lines he sold in his stores, and so a name that figured most prominently, it was said, that's a quote, in Custom House affairs. But most important, Woolworth took notice of Gilbert's skyscrapers, the Broadway Chambers building there on the left and the West Street building on the right. The Broadway Chambers building was right across the street from his Stewart Street headquarters, right across Broadway. And the West Street building located just a few blocks away on a prominent site facing the Hudson River. Woolworth especially admired the West Street building, the earliest example of Gilbert's own skyscraper Gothic style. According to contemporaries, this is exactly the type of skyscraper he wanted to build. It echoed the monuments of Europe, and by now Woolworth had traveled extensively in Europe. He went there at least every year on a buying trip, and he loved the cathedrals. It had highlights of color, an abundance of ornament, soaring verticals inspired by the Chicago architect Louis Sullivan, and a picturesque crown. architectural critics especially acclaimed the picturesque outline of the top of the building and city views. Montgomery Schuyler called attention to the crown as an inspiration, and Claude Bragdon noted the design's beauty in mass, outline, color, and detail, favored by the crown's detachment against the background of city and sky. Gilbert's original design for the West Street building featured a majestic central tower, recalling those found in Hotel de Villes or city halls, market halls, belfries, and other secular buildings of this type in Flanders, which is today's Belgium. Brussels, Compiègne, Middelburg, Alkmaar, and notably Bruges, which you see on the right. Gilbert had traveled to Flanders for the first time in 1897. His interest in the region, as documented in diaries and essay and travel drawings, was well established by the time of his West Street Building Commission in 1905. Gilbert was identifying modern commercial New York romantically and nostalgically with the Flemish free trading cities of the Middle Ages, calling to mind a simpler era of merchant autonomy with informal merchant communities, colonies of agents, far-flung routes of exchange. In reality, early 20th century New York was widely known for its large-scale economic consolidation, the kind of consolidation identified with the corporate headquarters of the nation. And this is actually where the economy was taking on a new structure and order, and this is being overseen by corporations headquartered in New York. It's a very sort of different thing than the free trading cities of Flanders. Gilbert was especially enthusiastic about street buildings' modularity and height. To give you a comparative idea, he wrote, "It is over twice as big on the ground as the Flatiron Building, and the tower and roof will extend 50 feet higher. In other words, it would be one of the guarding it." Contemporaries in New York, Charles McKenna, vociferously criticized the skyscraper, but Gilbert appreciated the twin cupolas of the Park Row building, and you see them on the lower left there, the twin cupolas of the Park Row building. Right there, sketched in the background, showing that he's eager to design the city's tallest skyscraper. Consequently, it's not surprising that he set his sight on the commission for Woolworth skyscraper. So how did that commission come about? There are a lot of contemporary stories, and those stories remain with us today. The question is whether Woolworth called Gilbert, or whether Gilbert, sketches in hand and eager to secure the commission, pursued Woolworth. Reportedly, there's a story, apocryphal, but nonetheless an interesting story. He coordinated a voyage to Europe with Woolworths and got the contract for the commission signed before the ship reached the opposite shore. That was the story of the architect Egerton Swartwood, who later went on to say that this commission was certainly the result of salesmanship. Gilbert was a very good salesman. Gilbert explained to a reporter, "One day I received a telephone call. It was Mr. Woolworth. He asked if I would consider a proposition to build a big structure for him. I said that was my business. He asked if I could drop in someday and talk things over. I happened to be going downtown that day. I visited his office. He outlined for me some idea of a skyscraper. Mr. Woolworth had an idea for the skyscraper for some time before he spoke to me about it." The builder, Louis Horowitz of the Thompson Sterrett Company, later noted that stories about Woolworth's plans to construct a skyscraper had been circulating in New York's community of builders for several years. Woolworth had, in fact, assisted Irving National Exchange Bank with a merger in 1907, and in 1908, the bank appointed him to a committee on quarters charged with finding a new location for the new and larger bank. Woolworth anticipated housing the bank as an anchor tenant in the main story of a new office building. And it would be a 20-story office building because that's what he outlined in his prospectus for the Broadway Park Place Company, so which he established in early 1910. So what we're seeing here are two drawings by Cass Gilbert, identified by the New York Historical Society as the Woolworth Building, but they are not drawings for the site that Woolworth eventually chose. This is very curious. They're for the Woolworth Building. They're 20 stories, but they're on this kind of ambiguous site. We don't really know where it is. Gilbert, it seems, is giving Woolworth a choice of styles. One is classical on the left, the other is Gothic. He's using the sketches as sales tools, hoping to win the commission for Woolworth's project. They're not dated, they're just there. By mid-April 1910, it is clear, though, that Gilbert had definitively secured the commission for the skyscraper. And we see one of his early sketches there on the right, and that's dated April 26th. That is when the sequence of designs that we associate with the project, and they're all at the site on Broadway and Park Place, begin. Woolworth now made his intentions very clear. He said to Gilbert, it's got to be modeled on the Victoria Tower at the Houses of Parliament in London, which you're seeing here on the left. That's what he specified. He liked the West Street building, but he wanted a building that looked something like the Victoria Tower. Inspired by the tower's composition, Gilbert culled from among photographs, etchings, and his sketchbooks the proper English perpendicular Gothic motifs for the skyscraper's ornamental features. Woolworth may have viewed the Victoria Tower as especially appropriate, given that it was associated with the British Empire. We think of the British Empire when we look at the Houses of Parliament. He viewed his own business as an empire. Also, he had recently opened a chain of stores in England. Gilbert, it was clear from the outset, envisioned this as a culturally significant work of architecture, not unlike his Minnesota State Capitol or his United States Custom House. But the competitive environment of vertical construction in which Gilbert and Woolworth were designing their skyscraper with its continual projection of skyscrapers to be built to record-breaking heights exerted a forceful and inescapable influence over the project. Woolworth had initially specified 20 stories, but here, even at the project's earliest stage, the design shows the addition of a 30-story tower to a lower 20-story office block. Gilbert's drawing suggests a pattern of steadily expanding ambition. Gilbert developed his design for the Woolworth building in 4 distinctive stages. In doing so, he collaborated with his chief designer, Thomas R. Johnson, with Gilbert producing sketches and Johnson skillfully rendered perspectives. For the first stage of design, which you see here, several schemes remain, dating from April 21st through May 12th, 1910. All of these schemes, like Gilbert's Victoria Tower-inspired sketch, show a tower, now ranging in height from 30 to 38 stories and from 420 to 550 feet. And this tower is combined typically with a lower 20-story office block. Johnson's perspectives acknowledge the Victoria Tower, but also show him responding to Woolworth's request for an inspired, and that's a quote from Woolworth, an inspired upward movement. And he responded to this request with verticals influenced by the skyscrapers of Louis Sullivan. Both he and Gilbert, we must imagine, are discussing these designs. Importantly, this first design surpassed in height the adjacent 32-story Hyde Park Row building located just across the street, the city's tallest, as you know, prior to the completion of the Singer Tower. Within only 3 weeks of beginning work on the project, however, Gilbert proposed a radically new design. The Woolworth building is the tallest skyscraper in the world, the 720-foot-high Scheme 17. This new design's composition combined an office block with a majestic central tower. Such a tower Gilbert identified with the many medieval civic buildings with towers of proportionally great height that had inspired his West Street building, the Hotel de Villes, market halls, and belfries of the Flemish free-trading cities. Scheme 17 required that Woolworth significantly enlarge the site. He had to take the whole Broadway he had to acquire the whole Broadway block front to build this project. It would be 152 feet beyond the original 80 feet of the original site. Only the plans for Scheme 17 remain, but within a few weeks, in July 1910, it's July 6th, Johnson produced Scheme 26, and that's what you see here. It's a variant of Scheme 17, where Scheme 17 was composed of two lower 20-story wings joining a tower. In Scheme 26, those wings rise to 28 stories. They're much higher. This base of the building is much higher, showing that Gilbert and Woolworth are testing workable financial strategies for the enlarged project. They're trying to see how many offices they can fit into the blocky base of the building. Regardless of the explanation for this world's tallest skyscraper, Scheme 17, and one explanation was that Gilbert said that Irving National Bank had growing spatial needs. It's still not clear who imagined that the project's arena of competition for the world's tallest would now extend beyond City Hall Park in the Park Row building to incorporate the entire panorama of Lower Manhattan. Scheme 26's floor plan similarly suggested a new level of ambition. Gilbert and Woolworth had decided to incorporate a new monumental lobby arcade on the central axis of the building, extending the full depth of the site. Constructing the 720-foot-high Scheme 17, or even Scheme 26, entailed, as I suggested, expanding the building site. And essential to expanding the site was the acquisition of a key corner parcel, and that was at the intersection of Broadway and Barclay Street, known as the Barclay Street corner. Woolworth had tried repeatedly to acquire that corner, but the owners were holding out. Early that August, Gilbert and Woolworth met at the Carlton House in London to inspect the Victoria Tower and to discuss the skyscraper's design over drawings of Scheme 26. Woolworth reported that he and the Barclay Corners owner, that Adelaide and John Hamilton family, were $50,000 apart on the price of the land. They had resisted his efforts to negotiate, and he had reached a breaking point, so he decided to give up entirely on Scheme 26. Gilbert know what to do. He sketched a scaled-back version of the project. You see that on the right. He sent it to Johnson in New York for further development. He knew that Woolworth would sail for New York and arrive in advance of his own arrival, so he urged his office manager, John Rocker, to very tactfully encourage Woolworth to build some revised version of Scheme 26. The architect Antonin Raymond, a draftsman associated with Gilbert's office at the time, later recalled that Gilbert had the genius and ability to exploit the ambition of Woolworth toward the realization of a monumental architectural creation without precedent. By August 22nd, Woolworth had changed his mind. Perhaps persuaded by Gilbert. He had firmly decided that he was not going to give up on Scheme 26. He continued to be haunted by the idea of dramatically altering Lower Manhattan's skyline with the construction of a spectacular Gothic tower. By that October, Johnson had produced the drawing you see here, a perspective for a Gothic tower reaching to a record-breaking height of 625 feet. Without the Barclay corner, Woolworth still couldn't get it. But Woolworth had acquired parcels to protect the light and air of his first design, and he added those to the site, so the site is slightly larger. And now, with this new design on the slightly larger site, Woolworth could top the height of the 612-foot Singer Tower and command the skyline of Lower Manhattan. Well, why did he do it? He had given up. Initially, it appears that he had discovered this notion right now at this point in the project of his giant signboard. The giant signboard provided a rational excuse to justify the irrationality of building to such an extreme height. And by the way, he only needed one story in this office building for his headquarters. The rest was purely speculative office space. He now counted himself among corporate moguls in New York. Singer's Frederick Bourne, Metropolitan Life's Rogers Hegeman, who, according to contemporary critic, erected skyscrapers with a keener eye to their advertising than their investment qualities. Louis Horowitz, the project's builder, later hailed what he called the new factor of value in advertising that the skyscraper would give the merchant's chain of stores. It was never hoped that it might yield, through rents, a fair return on Mr. Woolworth's big investment. So he was not going to make money on this. It was advertising, which made it feasible. Prior, and I'm going to just go back for a second, prior to completing the new design, Gilbert signed a contract with the project's engineer, Gunvald Aus. Aus was a structural rationalist. He had read the theories of the French rationalist theorist Viollet-le-Duc, and he believed that a skyscraper's structural uprights should receive the strongest emphasis visually, and these took on a heightened importance in this third design. In 1908, with the completion of the Singer Tower, the editors of Architectural Records summed up this phenomenon of advertising with towers built to such high altitudes. Now we possess a genuine tower architecture as an advertising feature on a rental basis. The tower, of course, will be a striking and spectacular feature. On November 13, 1911, Johnson's rendering of the Woolworth Building's third design filled the front page of the New York Times real estate section under the banner, "New Woolworth Building will eclipse the Singer Tower in height." Gilbert exhibited the third design at the Architectural League throughout December. For the moment, at least, both he and Woolworth viewed the design as final. It was spectacular enough in engineering, sumptuous enough in style, to fulfill Woolworth's aim of eye-catching advertising through printed media publicity. Woolworth, however, continued to remain indecisive about the skyscraper's final height. On December 13th, Gilbert wondered whether he wanted me to design the tower of his building at a height of 625 feet or to carry it up to something over 700 feet, high enough to be the highest tower in the world. Despite Woolworth's ambivalence about the question of height, the pressures of speculative real estate finance propelled the project forward. On November 4th, 1910, Woolworth ordered the foundation company to begin excavating the project site with pneumatic caissons, and on November 12th, curiously after construction started, the Bureau of Manhattan issued the project's first building permit. Even a quick decision by Woolworth about the tower's final height would result in wasted design efforts and costly construction delays. Significantly for Insurance Tower stood isolated in Midtown and the tallest office building in the world. Woolworth, meanwhile, was organizing a corporate merger. At the end of the coming year, $5 million private stock corporation would boast 8 district offices and a total decisively resolve the height of the Metropolitan Life Insurance. John Van Horn to ask tower. 100 feet, 2 inches above the Madison Avenue. Horn's measurement served as a benchmark, the benchmark for Gilbert's new and taller design. In a conceptual sketch, which you see here on the left, dated December 31st, Gilbert revised the proportions of backs, taking his cues from those of the Metropolitan Life Tower, transforming his tower into a slender and soaring Gothic campanile. Gilbert's newest scheme for the Woolworth Building was short-lived. On January 18th, and now we're into 1911, the Hamilton family, holding out at the Barclay Street corner, capitulated to Woolworth, offering their prized corner parcel at $100,000 less than Woolworth had proposed 6 months earlier. And earlier that January, Woolworth had purchased 3 and 5 Barclay Street, which allowed him to surround and isolate that Barclay Street corner. The owners feared a loss of the value of their property, given the shadow of the gargantuan structure that had been published on November 13th in the New York Times. On January 19th, 1911, Woolworth explained to the New York Times that, quote, "my building ideas have enlarged," and that he intended to construct the tallest building in the world. By the end of January, Gilbert had produced his final design for Woolworth Skyscraper. You see it here at 750 feet. It towered still higher than Scheme 17. Gilbert ordered the foundation company to halt constructions on the project's concrete pier footings, and then he told House that the foundation's piers needed to be shifted southward to carry a new centrally placed tower. House had completed shop drawings for the structural steel up to the building's 26th story, but he found that the central tower made possible a wholly new structural economy. So he decided to throw out the shop drawings and start his design all over again. At this later stage of design, Gilbert and his assistants added to their secular Gothic repertory innumerable motifs and details culled from an array of other medieval buildings, many of which were churches and cathedrals. They consulted countless printed images of Antwerp, Rennes, and Malines, and from Gilbert's own collection of drawings and sketchbooks, the West Tower of Ely Cathedral, which you see there at the center, and the Benedictine Abbey Church of Saint-Ouen in Rouen, and that's on your right. The skyscraper's height, in its own right, made the project spectacular, and for this, Gilbert continued to be indebted to the engineering expertise of Gunvald Aus. Aus complained about the conservatism of the New York Building Code, which dictated a massiveness of steel and structural design. He ended up over-designing the Woolworth by a factor of 4. But he still managed to devise an elaborate method of portal arch wind bracing. And this method of wind bracing infused the entire design with a screen-like delicacy because it allowed for wide spacing between the piers, giving it a remarkable sense of weightlessness despite that heavy steel. The result would be a light and diaphanous structure, very, very delicate elevations and open elevations that distinguish the Woolworth building's final design. Shortly after he completed the design, Gilbert sent his office's in-house perspective to the noted architectural delineator Hewson Hawley for coloring. Hawley's version of the Woolworth building, sparkling white with gilded roofs set against a blue and rose-colored sky, established the design even before construction as a widely recognized visual phenomenon. On May 4th, 1911 at 12 o'clock noon, and this is a couple months later, Woolworth, determined to promote the project as widely as possible, photographed and copyrighted Hawley's illustration and sent it to New York's major newspapers, the Times, the World, the Herald, the Tribune, the Post, with his own instructions for simultaneous publication for the sake of impact in their Sunday editions. This is a rather dramatic unveiling of Gilbert's Gothic design as colored by Hewson Hawley before a wide newspaper reading audience. And this counted among the cleverest of Woolworth's showmanship strategies. The photograph in the Times has an accompanying headline, "Woolworth building will be the world's greatest skyscraper." It's presented as if it were a self-fulfilling prophecy. Woolworth may well have contrived, with enterprising newspaper men, to create such a grand illusion as this, an early version of what journalists later called the modern media event. In April 1911, Woolworth signed a contract with Louis Horowitz of the Thompson Sterrett Construction Company, and now the builder, a third powerful figure, entered the project scene. With regard to construction, the Woolworth building stood at the industry's forefront in the eyes of builders representing no less than a record-breaking feat of modern construction. Perhaps that is why New York and the nation's two leading construction firms, Horowitz's Thompson Sterrett Company and the Fuller Company, among the few large enough to build Woolworth Skyscraper, competed vigorously for the project. Horowitz later noted that all my nightmares had to do with the black despair of failing to get that mighty contract. After winning Woolworth's contract, Horowitz described Thompson Sterrett's workforce as a modern building organization, a systematized and rationalized machine that can deliver buildings to their owners in a guaranteed time. That workforce included 180 structural iron workers who erected and riveted the frame in less than 9 months, setting a new record for speed. Horowitz aimed at no less than modernizing the city at a breathtaking pace. He wrote that every one of us felt himself to be an adventurer. We visioned the cities of America rising to dizzy, gleaming heights. We dreamed of unshaped inventions that would become part of the fabulous mechanistic structures that we were going to build. Even before the steel frame began rising in the city, Woolworth hired Hugh McAdamy, a press agent, but he called him director of advertising. McAdamy soon reported back to Gilbert that he had succeeded getting news items about the yet-to-be-completed skyscraper printed in 200 newspapers around the world. The city's newspaper reporters interwove the epic story of the skyscraper's ascent with human drama. Their accounts reached a climax on July 1st, 1912, with the towers topping off as the noon whistle blew. Charlie Campbell, Thompson Sterrett's steel superintendent, hoisted a 12 by 24-foot flag to the top of a 30-foot flagpole. Thousands of people in the streets, the reporters noted, paused to pay tribute to the highest building in the world. And now it's 792 feet because Gilbert has added another 42 feet to the design, and this was after it was completed because he wanted the tower to look taller. It was the aesthetics of the tower. In the end, McAdamy spent approximately $100,000 publicizing the that's in dollars of 1911 and 12, publicizing the construction of the Woolworth building, possibly the first campaign on such a scale for an individual building. In the process, he thoroughly ingrained the project within the city's print culture as well as its urban imagination, further sensationalizing an already sensational skyscraper. Woolworth's ambitions reached the heights of spectacularity with the contrivance of a breathtaking electrical opening by McAdamy on April 24, 1913. With McAdamy's assistance, Woolworth exploited New York City Hall Park as a supreme setting for urban spectatorship and printed news publicity. McAdamy had President Woodrow Wilson push a button telegraphically wire to the Woolworth's power plant from his desk in Washington, D.C., and 80,000 incandescent bulbs of its interior flashed on all at once. The skyscraper leapt into full view as a brilliantly illuminated object against the evening blackness. McAdamy then had news of the event flashed by Marconi wireless operators from the Woolworth's tower to the Eiffel Tower, and from there to all major European capitals. In the following days and weeks, one source estimated that some 2 million words of publicity about Frank Woolworth, the skyscraper, and the event filled American newspapers and magazines. All pointed to the vibrant urban culture of mass entertainment and mass spectatorship in which Woolworth and his skyscraper both competed and triumphed, and all pointed to a newly powerful role for the skyscraper in the city. Even while aiming to spectacularize the skyscraper in the city as well as the printed media, Woolworth also adhered to the more pragmatic notion that the skyscraper should function as a solid investment in New York real estate. The headquarters of his enterprise, as I had suggested, required only a single story, and the skyscraper's total of 55 stories. The remaining stories he aimed to lease as speculative office space. Yet at the time that Woolworth chose to build his skyscraper, New York was overbuilt. The real estate people said it was a gigantic gamble. He later recalled that it could never be filled. So based on his earlier experiment in Lancaster, he decided that he could, in fact, create his own land values. In New York, he would finance a skyscraper of such spectacular height, architectural distinction, and printed news media renown that no other rental property would compete with it. He claimed he was going to create a new center of attraction, outshine the other office buildings in the city, and so draw other commercial interests into his orbit. He would induce, he added, the city's leading corporate executives, entrepreneurs, and professionals to leave less glamorous office buildings and to relocate within his own. Woolworth had initially conceived the skyscraper as a setting for office work, to be sure, but soon enough the project evolved under his direction into one of the city's most prominent sites for high-style consumption, a city within a city. Through the integration of the newest fashionable consumer enticements, among them an interior shopping arcade, a health club with a swimming pool, a giant barber shop, a restaurant, a proposed downtown club, a pinnacle observatory, Woolworth Skyscraper provided an evocative and luxurious architectural setting for his tenants' high-style entertainment and amusement. Seeking to rival, if not to surpass, the most splendid of the city's settings for elite consumption, Woolworth and Gilbert conceived each of the skyscraper's interior spaces independently, with European styles of decorations and furnishings evocative of old-world wealth and splendor. It's almost as if they're setting up a European tour on the interior of this building. Tenants, as well as visitors, could experience the Irving National Bank's banking hall, designed to suggest old Elizabethan halls or houses, or they could visit the basement Ratskeller there on the right, patterned after the cellars of medieval German Rathhäuser or city halls in which merchants gathered and beer was sold. Or they could take a high-speed elevator to the tower's pinnacle observatory, stand in the octagonal peak's encircling balcony, and take in a panoramic view of the city. At 750 feet, a wholly new perceptual experience at the time. Those who experienced the Woolworth building were more than simply observers. They had become rather active participants in a modern social, spatial, and visual dynamic which involved the newly vertical urban surroundings. You can now see those skyscrapers from the observatory in complex ways. Woolworth expected the most fastidious of tenants, and he treated those tenants like his store customers as guests. In distilling the entire metropolitan experience within his world's highest skyscraper, Woolworth demonstrated his own faith in New York, which he now was calling the world's greatest metropolis. But the Woolworth building, especially given its renown as the world's tallest building, engaged other communities as well. Most notably, those comprising the day's technological enthusiasts. The Woolworth Building's engineer, Gunvald Aus, along with Horowitz and the Thomson Sterrett Company, as well as the thousands of workers who built the skyscraper, certainly appreciated. In March 1913, Scientific American featured the Woolworth Building on the cover of that month's journal as a monument of superior technological achievement, a great feat of engineering and construction, and an exemplar of national progress. The journal further noted in a competitive vein that American can take from France the prestige of the Tour Eiffel, the tallest structure raised by the hand of man, and can outdo it in every form and feature. The Eiffel Tower's airy tensile lightness contrasted with the Woolworth's more ponderous height, but in both Paris and New York, the modern city had become a theater, and the spectacle of iron construction that rose in well-timed increments to conquer previously unknown heights and to command the urban terrain excited observers. Louis Horowitz, not surprisingly, viewed the Woolworth building as a superior work of construction in its own right, and hence the defining work of his career as a builder. He called the skyline view of Lower Manhattan a, quote, three-dimensional memoir. As innovators in the construction industry, Horowitz and Thomson Sterrett took pride in participating as builders in the nation's larger ethos of technological experimentation, innovation, and achievement. But what was the significance of the highest in the world, in the eyes or in the mind of Frank Woolworth and Cass Gilbert? For Woolworth, first and foremost, highest in the world, furthered his aims of publicity and advertising, and this is especially clear in his decision, or in his belief that the building should be lit up at night because it could function as especially effective advertising by night. So on the new year 1915, Woolworth inaugurated the first scheme of floodlighting for any work of architecture, the very first scheme of floodlighting. He personally oversaw, he was actually climbing around the tower, the installation in strategic locations of 550 ordinary automobile lamps of the largest size. Rays shot upward at different angles from the tower's setback stories to complement equally powerful rays shooting downward. With a continuous diffusion of light, they transformed the tower after dark into what one contemporary called a shaft of glistening alabaster against the blackness of the night. Woolworth wrote to his store managers that the tower looks much handsomer at night than it does at any time during the day, and that, in fact, the building is a standing advertisement. And that one of the newspapers stated that if a newspaper had a circulation of 500,000, it could not reach as many people as the lights on the tower at night. Woolworth especially appreciated the many representations of the Woolworth building and skyline views. After seeing an illustration of the New York skyline during a trip abroad, he wrote that his skyscraper not only brought fame to itself, but also to New York. As New York skyscrapers rose higher, around and after the century's turn, publishers of images tailored for tourists documented the city's perpetually changing profile. During the same years, New York became the nation's leading tourist attraction as a destination in its own right. By 1900, it was receiving up to 200,000 visitors a day. Through the 1920s, the Woolworth Tower, coupled with the Singer Tower, held a dominant place in the city's skyline views. Woolworth took pride in the association of his world's greatest skyscraper with what he called the world's greatest metropolis. For Cass Gilbert, the Woolworth building's contribution to the composition of New York's new skyline, the world's first signature skyline, constituted the most important aspect of its reception in early 20th century New York. As the Woolworth building neared completion, so did the construction of William Kendall's municipal building. That's William Kendall of the firm McKinley & White, and you can see the municipal building just to the right of the Brooklyn Bridge there on the right. These towers, along with the Singer Tower, brought in their isolated arrangement a new order to the city's skyline. Creating views appreciated by the city's designers, and you can see on the right that's a poster for the city planning exhibition of 1913. The designers and planners appreciated views such as these, as did the city's promoters. And this view on the left is beautifully tinted with color and appeared in a number of publications associated with the Woolworth building. A writer for The Independent in 1910 noted that New York was not a city beautiful. It didn't matter because it had become, instead, a city majestic. Gilbert sketched a view of the city as the Woolworth Tower neared completion in 1912, calling it the most picturesque thing in the whole world. As we sailed farther and farther away, it seemed to swim in an atmosphere, like a dream city of towers and pinnacles. Its colors was fascinating, its silhouette enchanting. Later, Gilbert's contemporaries applauded him for making the New York skyline one of the wonders of our time. But in the end, it was the Woolworth building's place in the vast panorama of world architecture that surely had the greatest significance for Gilbert. The Woolworth's monumentality and architectural distinction made it a landmark of the sort worthy of inclusion in such a panorama. Architecture, as Gilbert viewed it, served, in his words, as the permanent recorder of the histories of the various ages of man. So if Woolworth prized publicity and advertising using the spectacle of the world's tallest building to make his skyscraper a true mass cultural phenomenon, then Gilbert, by placing his design within the trajectory of history, associated with the most selective of world landmarks, the Parthenon, the Taj Mahal, resisted the ephemerality of such spectacularization. So why the world's tallest building? Schuyler had noted that height would have been impossible without a commercial justification. He said, every projector of a building built for profit will carry it as high as he thinks it will pay to carry it. But I would argue that the reasons are as complex as the cast of characters who aspire to build structures that are the highest in the world. That's all. Thank you.